Next week's presentation, Don't Trust Your Gut, How to Make Better Decisions in Life by Rex Gale. Quite often people make gut decisions that they ultimately regret. What happened? What did their gut fail to give them? The decisions we make in life are heavily influenced by past experiences and the emotions attached to those experiences, resulting in an automatic decision that we make without really thinking. This talk will focus on the Nobel Prize winning concepts around decision making and provide a blueprint for helping people understand why and when the gut can be dangerous in decision making, when to trust it, and how to understand the difference. I don't have his bio, so we'll find out together who the heck he is, and maybe some of you already know who he is. So join us next week. Where is he? Hi, you want to just stand up and say hi?
Hi, everybody.
We'll see you next week, and I'll learn from you how you are. Okay. This week's presentation, Democracy Today, a global look at 3 types of government by Terry Rosson. Oops. I'm doing this on my iPad, so it's a little... Terry is going to focus his talk today on the democracy in 2022 at the global level. He will explore with us a brief history of democracy since 1700, including the women's right to vote, as well as dig into the many types of democracy, from full to flawed to hybrid. He is going to examine high-level pros and cons of each type, and during our Q&A session, we'll include a discussion of the benefits and commitments required by each type of democracy. Terry is chair of Democrats Abroad, Lake Chapala. He brings a passion for voter engagement and over 25 years in the communications, advertising, and marketing fields. The big question he works to answer: together, how can we help voters make the best choices for themselves in today's social media saturated world? Great question. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you. I'm on, right? Thanks very much, Kat. Well, I didn't know I had to follow that. So it's great to see you all here. I'm very excited. I see many faces I know from various endeavors like voter assistance that we do every Monday. So a little plug for that here at LCS. So I just want to start off by saying we got a challenge here today. The challenge is we're going to talk about democracy, but we're not going to talk about politics or parties or people that are in the news. That's not the goal today. So usually that makes for a pretty bland, boring presentation, but we're going to pull it off anyway together. So if anybody veers off, including me, I brought this little fake whistle. You can't really hear it, so we're not going to do that. But I'm going to give the fake whistle to Kat. And again, if I veer off, or if anybody in the audience veers off now or later, during Q&A especially, she's going to hold the whistle up, which means, please, take me out for a beer. We can talk till the cows come home, but try and keep it just to democracy. So let's have some fun with this. So the reason we're talking about this today is that I think for a lot of people, as you point out, even with that question from the little boy, kind of like democracy's in the air. If you're from Canada or the US, here in Mexico as well, we talk about democracy, but we don't always really know what that means. So today what we'd like to do is kind of look at where we are with democracy today. I'm going to use a thing called the Democracy Index, which is a thing that The Economist, which is a magazine, very centrist, very radical, they call themselves radically centrist, which they use, and it's highly respected, peer-reviewed. It's not somebody making up stuff, okay? So they have a very, as I said, well-recognized way of looking at democracies around the world. So I think this will come in handy as a tool in looking at what's happening in our lifetimes at this point. And I think you'll find it helpful. I hope you find it helpful. So what I want to talk today about, just to recap what Kat just said, is history since 1700. I'm not going to bore you with all these dates, but a few, so bear with me. Especially the women's right to vote, because I think that's a real indicator of where a democracy is in its development. And I have to tell you, I am no expert. I'm a layperson just like you. I do have an interest in this topic, but beyond some volunteer work, I'm just like you, really, truly. So, but I do think the woman's right to vote is a good barometer, a good indicator of how a democracy is functioning. So we're going to use that. As I mentioned, we're going to look at the full, flawed, and hybrid model that The Economist, hi Cecilia, I know it's not your real name, but anyway, sorry about that, that they use, and then the pros and cons of democracy. And there are pros and cons of democracy, so that's the whole idea. And then during the Q&A session, we want to talk about the benefits and commitments, because just like everything else in life, there are pros and cons, there are costs and benefits, and we want to make sure that we take a look at those. So hopefully not too ambitious a program for today. So the first thing that really popped out to me, first thing that popped out to me when I was researching this is that democracy is a very, very popular concept across the world. I was really stunned by this because only 7 countries in the world, I'll give you a couple examples in a moment, actually say they are not democracies. So basically everybody says they're a democracy except for Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan now, given the recent developments, Oman, the UAE, Qatar, Brunei, and the Vatican. I'm not sure where the Vatican fits in that, but yeah, that's the facts. So I found that interesting only because that wasn't where I came into this conversation. I thought that, some places, and I'm going to mention country names, but I'm not going to go into, again, people, politicians that aren't in that given country. I thought that they would be proud to have the system, at least as we see it, that they do. But no, most countries either aspire to or use it, I'm going to be very, direct, or use it as a smokescreen. That's how I see it. So, with that, let's talk about a little bit of history, just to give us some context and kind of a foundation to work from. So the oldest democracy, functioning democracy, continuously, is the United States. I thought I knew that, but I wasn't really sure, so that's actually a fact. And even PolitiFact checked that. So I know Colleen here is a big believer in PolitiFact, so I went and checked that just to be sure. Then Switzerland, then New Zealand, which I find very interesting, given that they have a woman heading up the government, and I think that's, just good to know. Then Canada, then the UK, and then we get into several Northern and Western European countries, Luxembourg, Belgium, Netherlands, Benelux, I guess, Norway, and Australia. So they're the top 10 in terms of longevity with democracy fully functioning. There are others, of course. I'll just kind of call out a couple. So one would be Israel, 1948, when they were founded. India, shortly after, when they became independent, 1949. So again, I think a good grounding for us. I think the takeaway is, for me, I think of democracy as always having been here. I grew up with it. But you know what? Most of the democracies in the world today are less than 50 years old. So that's really kind of an eye-opener for me in the sense that, we're thinking that this is just how it is. It's not just how it is at all. Democracy, which we'll talk about more later, requires active care and feeding. And without that, we'll move on from there. So, so a few democracy highlights in terms of historical, Canadian, Mexican, and United States. And I'm doing it in that order, in alphabetical order on purpose. So for anybody here who's wondering why that order, that's why. So it's not north to south, it's alphabetical order. So a couple of key dates: 1867, Canada became a country in its own right. You could argue that with the fact that the Queen is still, at least technically, on paper, head of government, but at the same time, I wanted to call out 1867, white men, property, similar to the United States, which we'll get to in a moment, had the right to vote. So it wasn't a huge group, because that doesn't cover the whole spectrum of people. In Canada at that point, given their requirements, it was about 50% of the vote, possibly 50% of the vote, which doesn't jive with numbers I'll share with you later for the US, but just know that when we talk about democracy, historically, until probably the 20th century, most people could not participate. They weren't eligible to actually be part of democracy. So we may think of it as a democracy, but it may not be our definition today. It was 1918 when women got the right to vote nationally in Canada. And that's about the same as some other countries, but more on that later. The interesting thing is there was a lot of back and forth, which I did not know, with women getting the right to vote. Some states in the United States actually gave women the right to vote. Canada, the same thing. Some states, some provinces in Canada, if I have my facts correct, took it away. So it came and went. So that's something that I did not know either, that I find really interesting, is some of these rights that we think are inalienable, no. They simply, that's simply not true in all cases. So let's go to Mexico for a moment. Mexico, and this is a little bit challenging because Mexico is typically seen as having a democratic government from 1917 forward, based on their constitution that came into play. However, and again, I'm just stating facts, it's not an opinion of any kind, as we all know, PRI, I am mentioning one party name because I have to make this make any sense for you. PRI actually had control of the government for about 70 years, and we know that that fell, 98, I believe was, 88. So it was essentially a one-party state. So how do you reconcile that it was a democracy, but a one-party state? I don't have an answer for that, so if you do, or anybody else here does, let me know. But that's the idea, is that they sort of have the framework of democracy, but the actual execution of democracy was different. And I think that's a really important thing to take away, is that you can have sort of a concept, but the actual execution of the concept can be very, very different. So does anybody know when women got the right to vote in Mexico? Any ideas? No? 1953. I know, that was I saw Colleen's response, or reaction, I mean. Yeah, I was surprised. I have more of those for you in just a moment. So take that information and do with it what you will, but that, yeah, I found that interesting. So let's move on to the U.S. So the U.S., 1787, the Constitution, not 1776, but the Constitution is ratified. 6% is estimated that actually were eligible to vote did vote. So this isn't who could have voted, this is actually who did vote. 6% made the decisions. White men with property was essentially the requirements. There were some other more detailed requirements, but that was basically it. In some states, it could even be that a woman could vote if she had property, but she had to be a widow. I don't know why. So I could guess, but there's really no point. So 1857, the Dred Scott decision, which basically said that African Americans, if they were even considered that, Americans, they really weren't considered that they were American citizens. That's really what the takeaway was there. That in fact, since they're not citizens, they can't vote. It's ranked as probably the worst decision, and this is not me. This is widely understood by historians, the worst decision of the Supreme Court ever. You can argue with that for a later time. And really in 1869 is when the women's suffrage movement started in the United States, and also pretty much concurrently in the UK. It was going on in many countries, but those in particular are the ones we typically hear about. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I'm sure some of you are familiar with those names. But it took a long time for that to actually play out and for women to actually have the vote nationally. Again, there were some states, interesting to me is like Utah, for example, if I have it right, gave women the right to vote mid-1800s and then took it away. And then it was given back to them, I don't like that word, but that's often the word that's used. It was given back to them in 1920. So interesting facts there. So let's do this again in terms of when women got the right to vote. So the first country, anybody have any ideas who the first country was and where?
Australia.
New Zealand, yes, 1893, yeah. So at least we made it into the 1800s, which is good. Then we've got Australia, Finland. I think I just bumped my... You still here okay? Okay, good. Australia, Finland is often considered the first country in Europe. 1906. Scandinavian countries were kind of ahead of the curve. Then there was World War I, and that kind of broke things loose for women in a lot of ways, in a good way. So Canada, Germany, Austria, and Poland, Great Britain, US, Hungary, all right around that same period, women's right to vote, suffrage. The ones I find interesting are, so we get out of Europe just a bit, Ecuador 1929, South Africa 1930. That one I have a hard time with because technically women got the right to vote, but I don't believe that, as we all know, with apartheid, that others got the right to vote, male or female. Brazil, Uruguay. Uruguay is an interesting country we'll come back to in a moment. And Thailand in 1932, Turkey, Cuba. Here's where it gets really fun. I haven't mentioned a couple major countries in Europe. So I guess France, Italy, Yugoslavia, and, well, Japan's not in Europe, but what year did women get the right to vote? Anybody have any ideas? 1945 blew my mind. I'm still like, I don't quite get it. So, in any event, I also want to point out that Quebec, however you want to say it, actually didn't give the right to vote to women until 1940. I don't know the history on that. I didn't have time to research that, frankly. So if anybody wants to share that later, about 20 years later, 22 years later, you could do that, but any Canadians in particular, but found that very interesting. All right, and as I said, another interesting country in terms of women's right to vote, Afghanistan. So they were first given the right to vote in 1964. That was revoked in 1996. And then we know kind of the story from there with the American involvement. All right, so let's talk about the democracy index. As I mentioned, there are three categories we want to focus on: full democracy, flawed democracy, and hybrid. I'm going to start at the bottom first because I think hybrid is the least intuitive, at least it is for me. I don't, frankly, much like the definition, but it is what it is. So hybrid is considered an aspirational, or as I mentioned, my take, in many cases it's a smokescreen. Like, we don't really think we're a democracy, the leaders don't anyway. But we call it that, it mollifies some people. It kind of is what it is. Full democracies, I think that's probably pretty obvious, but if not, we'll go over the categories, the criteria. And then flawed democracies are democracies that have basically the concept of doing X, and like we talked about before, they don't always execute. They just aren't able to quite pull it off like they say that they want to. So, what are some characteristics or some criteria for a full democracy, kind of the gold standard? secure elections, fair and free elections. Voters feel secure in going to the polls. That's huge. I like this one, multiple centers of power. So it's not a one-party state. It's not like everything's concentrated in one area. High participation by a large swath of the eligible voting population that are not just tolerated but respected and even grow over time. Checks and balances, independent media, of course, watchdog function when they're doing that function. Also found this one very interesting. Civil servants can actually implement policy without interference from the different parties that might be empowered at any given time. And then, of course, strong, consistent rule of law. So a flawed democracy, before I move on, so let me give you a couple of examples of a full democracy as rated today. And these ratings change year to year. They do this every year with this democracy index. Typically, you don't see big shifts, but in general, there's movement here and there. So Scandinavia in general, as I just mentioned, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Canada, New Zealand, and Switzerland are considered full democracies. That's most of them. So that's a pretty high bar to reach. You notice that some other countries weren't mentioned in that, that grouping. So flawed democracies, let's talk about flawed democracies. What's the definition first? Generally secure elections. Voters generally feel like there's not the threat of violence, that, those kind of things. There is some suppression, so the key word there is some, suppression of political opposition, some suppression of media and critics, lower participation. I don't know what the benchmark is at this point, but I'm not sure how the Democracy Index calculates that, because it varies tremendously by country and even by midterms versus presidential elections, for example. Dysfunctional government, what that means is polarization, things like that. And underdeveloped political culture. That's kind of a weird one for me because I'm not sure how you separate out culture in general with political culture. But, just people's tolerance for ambiguity, for differences in opinion, that type of thing. So flawed democracies are, a couple examples are the US, Japan, Israel, and India. And so if you know what's going on in each of those 4 countries, I think that actually does sort of fit. I will say that COVID made things worse as far as democracy, because there were lockdowns, there were these kinds of things, and there was an agreement, as we all know, across the board about how this should be implemented, even if it should be implemented at all. So that certainly shoved some countries, even Canada got lots of demerits, let's say, for their approach in implementing COVID mitigation. Let's see, hybrid, just to kind of define, I think it's, based on what I said before, probably pretty obvious, but regular election fraud. So it's not like it's now and then, it happens, if not every election, most elections. Regular suppression of opposition, non-independent judiciaries, basically anemic rule of law, so weak rule of law. And violence is usually, if not common or regular, there's always a threat of violence. It's sort of in the background or becomes an actuality. Yeah. So I find this very interesting because we all live here in Mexico, I think. Well, I know some people are visiting, but for the most part we all do. So a couple examples of hybrid are Mexico, where we live today, Hong Kong as it stands today, and the Ukraine. So I'm not sure, I don't think that the Democracy Index doesn't take into account what's going on in Ukraine. I'm not even sure how they would reflect that, but kind of blows all the criteria away. So, yeah, how am I doing on time? I should ask Kat. Okay. So, as I mentioned, the current states of democracy, Just to recap, we've got in the full democracy, we've got Scandinavia, New Zealand, Canada, Ireland, Australia, and Switzerland. Kind of the next tier down, we've got Germany and the nearby countries that border on Germany. I love these two. Uruguay is also in that full democracy category. So I want to know more about Uruguay to find out what we can learn from them. Mauritius, which I think is also very interesting. My old yoga instructor used to be from, well, she's still from Mauritius. She's just not here any longer. And I did a little study on that just because I didn't know anything about the country. And I thought that's really interesting to learn how that works. Spain, France, Portugal, also Costa Rica and Chile. So right here in Latin America are in that next tier down. But still, you know, they're doing well overall. Going to the third tier down, we've got the US, as I mentioned, South Korea, Japan, Israel, Taiwan. Now, there's been a lot of movement with Taiwan in the last couple of years, so I'm interested in finding out more about why that's so. Again, not an expert, but they've made some good progress. And then down in, so these are all groups from 1 to 167. That's a lot of grouping. That's a lot of countries, I mean. So in the 40s is Brazil and India. And then in the 80s, so more or less halfway, Mexico, Hong Kong, and Ukraine, which I just mentioned. So just information for you to know. I think that's gives us a good perspective to understand where we are today. And if you want to learn more, I have a really simple solution for you, or suggestion for you. Google Democracy Global, and you can go from there. It's in Wikipedia, which was one of my key sources. You know, I didn't want to go to anything that was controversial in the sense of people's perceptions, or there wasn't really clear-cut criteria that is not recognized. So again, nothing that I made up. So I want to really stress that. All right. So let's move on to pros and cons of democracy, because I think that it's really important that we understand that democracy is not a panacea. It's not like a magic wand that somebody waves, that you wave, and everything is solved. There are good parts, there are not such good parts, or at least there are very challenging parts. So in terms of government and governance, some pros are that democracies tend to be solutions-focused, not power-focused. And that means that there's a chance for growth. That means there's a chance for improvement. In general, stability is a feature of democracy. Usually when there's more participation, there's less angst, but you can certainly argue that with some authoritarian governments that, in fact, they can be very stable for many, many years, but when they do blow, so to speak, they go. The con to that is that with all of the solutions focus, there's tension, there's conversation, there is a lack of speed, let's call it. That's one argument that China, for example, today is putting out there that democracies are slow. They don't get things done well, they drag their heels, they take too long to implement. And I think that's an interesting conversation. What's the answer? I don't think there is an answer. So I think we have to just pay attention. So next category would be, obviously, I think this goes without saying, but a pro of democracy is that everyone, in theory, or most people can, in fact, participate. And one good thing that comes out of that is creativity. There have been many studies done where it was looked at, you've seen this probably if you've been in the corporate world, I know, I can relate to this personally. Do teams come up with better results, or do individual people come up with better results? And by and large, teams do, because you get a wider perspective, and therefore you get creative solutions across the board, not just in one key area. So creativity, and I think we've heard about that over the years, that certainly democracies can bring forward a lot of innovation, technology, that kind of thing, with all its pros and cons. The flip side, the con side of that is that democracy requires a lot of participation. And not everybody wants to do that. They have lives to live, they have kids, who knows. They're not focusing on that. The other thing is it may be that mob rule could be an aspect if you get the right people in place who want to kind of generate that. It's open to demagoguery, where you can get people who are saying, let's put this group against that group. And again, if people are not heavily invested in actually educating themselves, then that can result in some pretty bad outcomes. All right, so back to the pros in terms of government, rule of law, equal justice, civil liberties. I think the con there is it's hard to balance the competing interests. It's tough. I mean, we see that today in many, many cases. You can agree with this or not. I'm not sure if I agree with this, but economic growth. And I think the statement there is as compared to other forms of government. The con may be because of that focus on economic growth, greed, a lack of balance in everyday life, work-life balance, for example. And then what kind of comes out of all this, too, is an individual focus that many cultures don't have. And many, even democratic cultures don't have, in terms of individual becomes like the unit. To the extent that we're so focused on individual needs, we don't think about group needs. And that's a downside, because the reality is we all want to belong, and we have to balance our individual needs against group needs and against competing groups' needs. So it's an interesting challenge to be had, and curious to hear if anybody has any thoughts or questions about the pros and cons when we get to the Q&A section. So I'm going to just wrap it up now, just about there. So what I want to talk about, and kind of to pave the way here, is democracy in terms of personal benefits to you personally, and responsibilities, because it comes with both. So just to kind of prime the pump here, I'll throw out some. So a benefit to you might be hope, the chance for improvement, the fact that your government's trying to find solutions and not just trying to keep somebody in power, keep a given group in power. The cost might be, in this case, that you got to have your hands on the wheel of democracy. There's no autopilot for democracy. I know autopilot's coming from Tesla and whatever, but doesn't exist and shouldn't exist for democracy. And then, what do you think about in terms of what you need to do as far as participation? What does it require of you to be an active member of democracy? Do you like being an active member of democracy? Is that something you feel like you want to step up to? Standard of living. Does democracy give you any better outcome than some other government form, for example? And then what I mentioned last but not least was that tension between an individual focus and belonging. Because those two can honestly be in conflict in some cases. So that's where I'm going to end. So there you have it. We went over a brief history. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope there were some things you came up with, or will take away with you, I should say. The current states of democracy according to the Democracy Index. So that was the full, flawed, and hybrid. And then pros and cons. So with that, hope you enjoyed that. Hope that was helpful. Q&A.
Okay, I've got the fake whistle, but it doesn't do crass.
It doesn't do it. That's why it's fake.
So if you start talking about and
Right.
I'm actually just going to say stop. I've got the mic, so I'll say stop. We'll start with you. And if you can belt it out, that's great. If you'd like my help, I'll come over to you and you can tell me what your question is and I'll relay it. Okay, and you'll repeat the question so that
Okay.
everybody can hear.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
You refer to the index by The Economist
Right,
and the ranking.
right.
And I was wondering why in that ranking the U.S. ranks as a flawed democracy, ranked number 26.
Right.
In fact, dropped from 25 to 26 that year. What are the factors that make that happen for the United States? That don't
Sure.
work for democracy?
Great question, thank you. Did everybody hear that question? Okay.
You did.
How did it drop, how did the United States drop in its rating of democracy?
So I think that's a great question. Thank you for repeating that question. The criteria again, right, right. So as you remember, as maybe you don't remember, I'll just go over the full criteria. So elections are secure. No one is questioning the outcomes. There's a peaceful transfer of power, those kinds of things. There's high participation rates. Now there have been high participation rates the last 6 years. They've gone up in the U.S., so that's you know, that's encouraging. But that said, voters don't feel as secure. They don't feel like there's, you know, solid ground under their feet. A lot of, what's the word I want? I would just call it media bashing. A lot of watchdog bashing has been taking place in the U.S. recently. And that's a problem because if people don't feel like whistleblowers, the media, anybody who feels like there's a better way to be doing things or there's actual corruption going on, if that's not happening, the watchdog dynamic is not happening, then we know what can happen. You know, people go off in their own direction. I'll just leave it at that. And the other one that I found interesting is that there's some talk about here we go, deep state. So, which that relates to the fact that the civil servant category cannot do its job without having a lot of interference. So there's a lot of expertise involved in making sure that folks actually do their job without having partisan, you know, ends in front of them. So those are some of the key reasons that it's dropped down from, I don't know when it was I think it was last a full democracy, maybe 10, 12 years ago, the US, but it has dropped down. There has been a decline. So hopefully I answered your question. Thank you.
Yes.
I consider myself a moderate, but I feel for many years completely disenfranchised. I don't feel like I have a voice.
Okay.
Because we have a two-party system that, in my perception, has moved, you know, from primaries and different reasons toward the ends.
Right.
More toward the ends of the political spectrum, and kind of left the middle without much of a voice. And I was just, and you know, a lot of countries have, what do they call it, proportional representation or something, so that a lot more people, a lot more points of view get some votes. And I was just wondering what you think about that and how that relates to democracy, because I don't think I've got a vote.
Wow.
Plus we've lived in California for many years, and did the whole electoral college. You know, I mean, there's millions and millions of people that don't have a vote, period.
Thank you. Did everybody hear that? Go for it.
All right. So I think that was the multiple centers of power. So that was, I mean, that's sort of an academic, heady way of saying, why do we just have two parties in the U.S., two viable parties, I'll call them that. Because a lot of people do get left behind, and in fact, the stats now are that in the U.S., 41% are independents. I think it's 35 are Democrat, and I can't do my math that quickly, but whatever the remainder is, I believe is 28% Republican. So that independent category has grown so much because of what you're just talking about, I believe, where people feel like neither party really speaks to them as much as it could. So all I can say is I think that you have a really great point. I think that the parties both have a huge need to communicate to the middle voters, Democrats, independents, moderate Democrats, independents, and I'm trying to avoid, let's just say principled Republicans. So whatever that means to you. So hopefully that helps. I feel like I don't want to get into the political too much, but I hear what you're saying. Let's put it that way.
Yes, Barbara.
Thank you. Getting people elected is number one, right? And so voting is essentially important in a democracy.
Right.
However, and I'm speaking as someone who was elected 5 times to the state legislature of Massachusetts, that's just step one.
Mm-hmm.
The power and influence of money at the state level, at the federal level. We know about Citizens United. The only thing to counter the influence of money, both in elections and in getting legislation passed, is citizen advocacy. And I could do a whole talk on that. Maybe I
You may be
will.
up here next week.
No, but it's true. I mean, we can't just go out and vote and get other people to vote. We have to advocate, get groups of people to have meetings with our representatives and make the case for passing laws that are in the best interest of people, the environment, and all of that.
Can you phrase that in some way as a question, Barbara?
Oh, okay. So I just wonder what you think of the
You're all doing what do I think, but okay, that's fair.
No, but what do you think about the way big money influences elections and people who get elected?
Okay, so everyone heard the question, big money elections. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you very much for your point about voting by itself is not enough. However, I will take voting by more people any day of the week. I will say that I mean, it's kind of in my blood, but it's not in everybody's blood. I think what you have to do is have, what this gentleman over here was sort of suggesting, is more points of power, meaning you've got to have groups that are on the ground that people feel like they can go talk with, because I don't think everyone's going to run for an office. God forbid, I could never do that, never want to do that. I think that, I think it's tough. I think especially for people in the middle, but again, see themselves as having very busy lives, it's hard for them to conceive of going and talking with their rep. It's not that hard to write a postcard. I mean, even, it's not that hard, but people have a perception that it's so difficult to get your voice heard. I think that's what we have to attack, is that perception that all you have to do is call up. And frankly, yes, you'll probably get an answering machine. I've certainly experienced that many times, but find some way to send it in, because what occurs to me is what FDR said. People have to make me do the right thing. I love that phrase, because if I don't have your backing, I don't make any progress with folks that may have a different viewpoint. So we have to participate more than just voting. But again, in this environment today, we're just trying to get people to the voting booth, and hopefully that will have a ripple effect and go from there. People who, especially younger folks, who've never had a voice. What to do about the money issue, that's a whole other topic. I got to agree with you. I wish I had more answers. The only thing I can think, more involved. Vote and be involved. But that's tough. So thanks for, again, the question.
Okay.
You're choosing
Let's see.
people, right?
How about here?
First, quick question.
Sure.
What category does Russia and China fall in?
Oh, they're in the authoritarian category. They're not even on the map that I was focusing on today. Yeah, I think China's like 150 or something to that effect, and Russia's just a little bit better. Again, this was pre-invasion.
And just
So-
comment on the big money problem,
Yeah.
how you solve it.
Yeah.
In Canada, there's a limit on how much you can spend for an election. And
Right.
and people have ended up in jail for breaking.
Right.
And that way, big money can't go in and buy these things.
Thank you for saying that. I didn't want to go
You've
there.
got some nice murmurs happening right now.
Yeah, this is
All
great,
right.
this is great.
This is like church, all right.
I think you're 100% on the right track.
And you're not.
That's longer term.
There's great examples all over the world,
Right.
especially the Scandinavian countries in my mind, and we can learn
Right.
from those.
That's exactly it. That's why we even did this, was we can learn from other folks. We don't have all the answers about democracy. Nobody does it. Mexico doesn't, the US doesn't, Canada doesn't, nobody does. So we can all learn from each other. That's the whole point. Thank you.
Take over here and then I'll go to the far
All
right.
right.
Here.
I'm not sure how this translates into a question.
Please try. I really want questions.
Thank you, Kat.
I've always believed we need forces pulling us to the left and forces pulling us to the right, and ideally we stay in the middle and move forward. When we go too far to the left, we fall in the ditch over there. When we go too far to the right, we fall in the ditch over there. Do you think that there are any forces currently that are moving toward that kind of balance? Or do you see us as becoming more and more unbalanced with two groups?
Okay. Everyone heard that question? So I'm going to give you the answer from the New York Times. You either trust them or you don't. That's all I can say. They did an analysis about a year and a half ago, and they looked at, kind of like the Democracy Index, they looked at where, I think you're asking about the US?
Yes.
Okay, let's just cut to the chase. So they looked at where Democrats are in terms of moderation, or in terms of the spectrum, from far left to far right. This being the middle, the moderate middle you were just talking about. Democrats have moved infinitesimally, incrementally to the left. Republicans in the last 10 years have moved hugely to the right. So I think there's a misperception that they're both moving in sync, in equal measure to either the left or the right. And that's just, from everything that I read, that's not the case. So first of all, I think we have to deal with reality and not with what I would call the pretend perception that they're both equally moving in opposite directions. And then take it from there. I'm going to stop at that point. But just say that, I think we have, that's the whole point with this, is let's look at reality and deal with that, and then have some real informed conversations as opposed to simply playing off perceptions and opinions only. So, hope that was okay and I answered for you, but that's my take.
Okay, back.
If I'm not mistaken, the top 10 groups you said are all parliamentary systems.
Well, the U.S. Oh, you may be right. I hadn't thought of that.
I think that's the problem in the States.
Top 10 parliamentary.
I'm a Canadian.
Interesting.
I'm a Canadian. There's like 4 major parties and a couple others around there. Everything isn't black and white. It's a lot of gray.
Right.
In Canada, we have choice to vote for the gray. I have voted for every single party in Canada because of who the people were, what they stood for at that particular time. Where in the United States, you're stuck. You're 1 or 2 and that's it. Now, can that be changed somehow?
Okay, don't show off.
I'm living in Mexico.
We know it.
I mean, what can be done to alleviate that problem?
Is he right that they're parliamentary systems?
I don't know about Switzerland, but I would say yes, from looking at this list, several of them are in fact Commonwealth countries, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, obviously.
Parliamentary. Commonwealth or Commonwealth.
I think that is a problem that, the world, as I see it, the world is absolutely not black and white. I think everyone said that in one way or another. Every question is sort of been premised on that point.
Okay.
I don't know the answer how we move. We've tried third parties in the U.S. and it's been less than successful. If anybody has a suggestion, I'm all ears.
They've actually been somewhat successful because their ideas got adopted by...
That's true, right, they were absorbed, right.
Here, wait.
Switzerland is labeled as a semi-direct democracy, semi-direct.
Okay, and is it parliamentary in terms of,
Yes.
okay, okay.
But if they have that, occasionally on a law, they have a consensus of all people. All people meet and decide in every place what the law should be.
Okay. I will tell you that, oh, go ahead, sorry. Poor guy, sorry.
It's okay. This morning I saw a chart done by the Pew Research Institute, and in the last 30 years, we've gone from Republicans hating, the United States point of view, we've gone from about 20% of Democrats and Republicans believing that the other party had absolutely nothing to offer.
Right.
Today, Republicans are about 64% that the Democrats have nothing to offer. Democrats are about 52% that Republicans have absolutely nothing to offer. I would go back to the framers of the Constitution, and we use the term democracy very broadly.
Yes.
The framers were not Democrats. They distrusted the people. And so they tried to broaden the power that the rich and the famous had at that point in time, and we've been chipping away at that. But today in the United States, you will find that there is a great number of people who say we have a constitutional republic.
Right.
And others say we have a constitutional democracy. Where are we today? Are we a republic or are we democracy?
I just want to say one thing before you answer this. Have any of you seen Ben Franklin? How many here have seen Ben Franklin? This is Ben Franklin.
Oh, okay, that's
You
cool.
may not recognize Steve without
That's
his...
great, no,
You
how
don't
would
know him
we?
as a
How
bald
would we?
man, but
Right.
yeah, anyway.
Well, boy, let me just solve this problem like that. I have no idea. I mean, no, you're right. I mean, I know there's one gentleman in a Midwestern state, more or less, who says we're not a democracy, we're a republic, a constitutional republic. I take great umbrage at that particular statement because I've never done a search myself, but apparently the word democracy does not show up in the Constitution. Anybody who wants to fact check me, please go for it, but which pains me deeply because I don't see that way. I don't see there being a conflict between being a democracy and a republic at all. But I think the comment that we're not a democracy is a step to say we're going to go back to 1900 when we didn't have direct election of senators in the U.S. I think that's the game plan. And
Uh-oh, do I have to blow this?
yeah, maybe, I don't know. I'm not sure how else to answer the question.
Just a second. I would posit that the Electoral College is an example of a republic
Right.
and not a democracy.
Right, right.
But that's the last question. Our time is up. You will be around. Thank you, everybody. Those are...
Oh, I have to put a plug in.
Yes,
Okay.
okay.
All right.
For any U.S. citizens that want to try to make a difference and participate, anybody felt left out, you still can be involved. And I think the independents have a big influence on what
Yes.
happens in the United States. We come here to LCS to help all U.S. citizens register and request their ballots. If anyone hasn't requested is there anyone here that hasn't requested their ballot yet? See me after. I'll help you make sure you get your ballot. You can get it here by email. Participation, as you said, is key if we're ever going to make any changes.
But also, you're here every Monday,
We're here
right?
every Monday.
Every Monday.
Every Monday, you can sign up to get your ballot.
10 to 12:30.
So people are saying, how far out, which ballot are they asking for?
So there's just a handful of primaries left.
Right.
So in most cases, what you're going to be asking for is your ballot for November 8th in the U.S. And your ballot, just so you know, I'm going to put this in there now because I think people need to have this deadline in front of them. Your ballot should be, if you've already done your registration and your request for ballot, your ballot should, through our program, not only our program, but through it's it's called UOCAVA, which is basically the military and overseas citizens group, you should be getting your ballot in email on September 24th. That's the key date. So I want to dismiss or dissolve this misperception that we all have plenty of time to vote on November 8th, not from Mexico. So if you want to go back and do it, that's great. But if you're doing it from Mexico, especially if you're in a mail-back only state, if you can only get your ballot back by mail, and there's 18 states that fall in that category, you need to do it in September. So strongly recommend that.
Okay, now after this talk, I imagine you'd like some tequila.
I know I do.
Please buy some tickets and join us for the tequila tasting. It was a blast last year. I got to taste things that I would never be able to afford to buy. So we'll plug on that. Thank you, everybody, for your participation in democracy. And we'll see you whenever we see you, and hopefully next week.
And thank you all again.